Zoom in on global affairs with insightful debates and exclusive interviews. This is World Insight.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled against the Trump administration's ability to impose tariffs through emergency powers. A 6-3 Supreme Court decision on Friday dealt a blow to the White House legal authority to collect sweeping tariffs. U.S. President Donald Trump lost no time expressing his disappointment over the court ruling. He announced an executive order raising global tariffs up to 15% through other legal means, though with limited authority. So, what does the court decision mean for the U.S. administration's trade policy in the short and the long run? How does this ruling figure with major U.S. trading partners? What will it take to roll back the struck down tariffs? And does it mean U.S. companies get a refund? Let's turn to our panelists. For more, in Kunshan, Zhang Quelch, Executive Vice Chancellor and American President of Duke Kunshan University. In Portland, Yan Liang, Creamer Chair Professor of Economics with Willamette University. Last but not least, in San Francisco, Anthony Chen, former J.P. Morgan Chase Chief Economist. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. Happy the Year of the Horse, according to Chinese New Year calendar. However, we have already a lot of drama at the very beginning of this dramatic year. So what does that mean to all of you when we see a fight between the Supreme Court of the United States and the current White House about who has bigger power in saying what to be done about tariffs? Now, to you, Professor Quelch.
It's a refreshing assertion of the checks and balances that is the foundation of the U.S. democratic system. But of course, the end result of the Supreme Court decision is to create more uncertainty and more confusion, particularly after the president has asserted 15% global tariff under the 1974 Trade Act, Section 122, which has not been asserted previously. So we have, on the one hand, some good news regarding the U.S. constitutional system. On the other hand, some challenging news with respect to the tariff and supply chain regime internationally.
These IEEPA-related tariffs have really done damages to the U.S.'s domestic economy as well as its credibility as a trading partner in the global, economic system. But unfortunately, as John mentioned, instead of course correct, Trump actually doubled down. Right? He opened up a sort of a alphabet soup of tariff acts that ranges from the 122 basically. Was to impose up to 15% within 150 days to correct the U.S.'s balance statement difficulties. He also hinted that he would use other measures, such as, he has been using 232, which is sector-dependent, sector-specific kind of tariffs, and also 301, which is to address unfair trade practices. He also referred to Section 338, which is, again, a very arcane kind of trade act that was in 1930s. That would, address sort of discriminatory acts towards the U.S. goods. So in any case, I think what he's trying to do right now is to buy some time by enacting this 122 in order to seek further actions. So I think right now the tariff is not only used as an economic policy tool, as a foreign policy instrument, but also as a way to challenge, in some ways, the Supreme Court. And basically, saying that the Supreme Court cannot completely take away, his tools, his tariffs, but he would find other ways to impose tariffs on trading partners.
I see. Mr. Chen, your immediate takeaway about what the decision and the tug of war means?
What it tells me, however, is that the president will have less flexibility than he had before. Obviously, in the beginning and getting out of the gate, he's trying to show that he has as much flexibility and as much power as before, but he really does not. The Section 122 that both Professor John and Professor Liang mentioned, that's temporary. It's only good for 150 days. And in fact, that authority is basically to address a sort of a balance of payments, emergency, or a serious situation. But when they were arguing these same arguments at the Supreme Court, the issue of Section 122 came up, and the Trump administration attorneys or lawyers basically said, no, we don't want to use Section 122 because it's not appropriate. We want to use the IEPA. And so now all of a sudden they're going to use the Section 122. It's kind of a challenge because if they said they were not allowed to use 122, it was not appropriate, and now instantaneously it's appropriate, there's a lot of inconsistencies out there.
People in the business community, as well as those end consumers, are very confused as to what does this mean for their business plan, for their cooperation with their partners, and also for their budgets, daily consumption, for example, especially in the United States.
So there are a number of issues. One has to do with the refund of the previously collected tariff revenues. And as we know from the U.S., the Federal Reserve at New York, their study has shown that 90% of these tariffs were borne by the U.S. consumers and importers. So in other words, but the Trump administration, of course, doesn't seem to say there is an automatic process of refund. So they're talking about, lower courts are going to handle these refunds. So that creates a lot of uncertainties, and also, I would say, a wave of litigations. They're going to be lengthy and also costly. So really, the lawyers, right, are the ones that are going to really gain from this whole process of refunds. And second, I think is even with the removal of the IEPA, but now with the 122, this is still an additional cost on families. And so previously, I think on average, families are paying $1,700 per year for the IEPA tariff, and now the estimate is again at least $1,000 or $1,300 per family. So that could still be costly for families. Now, the other, I think, difficulties here is what are these trade deals that Trump has struck with other countries are going to go from this point on, right? Because we know that there are countries like UK or South Korea and Japan, they have reached a trade deal and pledges investments and other concessions to the Trump administration. But now that the IEPA is going to go away, then what happened, to these tariff trade, trade deals? So I think that, again, has a lot of uncertainties already when it comes to, how countries are going to react. And last but not the least, as we just mentioned, the 122 is likely to be temporary and just to buy time for the Trump administration to consider other alternatives. And so that means which countries will be subject to what tariffs and what sectors will be imposed more tariffs and at what timeline, all these become uncertain. So I think you're right that I think both businesses and consumers are facing really a tremendous amount of uncertainties going forward.
Right. As we know, 10 or 15% is not a small number for businesses. How business leaders would try to digest all of this, what logic would apply, and how they are looking at, if possible, the 150 days, so to speak, the midterm election following up. What does this mean for their business plans?
I think uncertainty is never a positive for business plans. But if you look at the data, you can really clearly see the impact of this uncertainty. The ADP report in the United States that looks at job creation for small businesses, medium and large businesses, what you're seeing is that the small businesses are facing the most pressure in job creation. And that is because they have less flexibility. You're seeing a little bit more flexibility for the large businesses because, in fact, the anecdotal evidence and surveys that the Federal Reserve has conducted show that they have greater flexibility to adjust their costs. They have greater flexibility to adjust their prices because they have many, many products. And what they actually have been doing, according to these surveys, is they've been increasing the prices sometimes of non-tariff goods because they don't want to increase the tax of all the tariff goods only, so they can spread it out and it's not noticeable. But small businesses, they don't have as many products to play with. They don't have as many resources, so they are paying a heavier price. And in the United States, close to 80% of all the new jobs that are created are in small businesses. So if you hurt this sector, you are hurting the U.S. economy. You are hurting employment growth.
Right. Professor Quelch, Professor Liang made a great point about how countries will react to this, because there were earlier so-called trade deals, compromises, investments, and the list goes on, technology sharing and many others. So what does that mean for these economies? How are they likely to calculate and see where their best interests are?
In 2025, of course, U.S. imports from China dropped around about 30%, and much of the trade has been reshuffled through Mexico, India, and Vietnam, that overall have been net beneficiaries in terms of improved trade surpluses with the United States. Further tariff uncertainty of this nature may actually add further motivation for rebalancing of trade into those economies. But I think that the broader point that you mentioned is correct, that the credibility of the United States in terms of the trade deals already made, as Liang said, especially with those countries, UK, Japan, Korea, that have brokered deals that involve considerable offshore investment into the United States as part of the arrangement. These particular so-called deals are actually up in the air again. It's worth noting, I think, that there is a considerable list of exemptions associated with the new 122 tariffs that have been implemented. My rough calculation is that approximately 35% of all imports that would be affected by, or could be affected by, the 122 tariffs will actually be exempt. So we'll have to look at the detail on this, which countries are advantaged or not, or penalized more than others with respect to where the tariffs actually fall on their respective exports to the U.S.
Right. We see this process by the Supreme Court of the United States. It really takes a long time. It's almost like after the dust settled in terms of how other countries are reacting to the Trump administration's tariffs against them. I mean, the sweeping, the floor tariffs against all of the other economies. Some wonder whether it's too late. Secondly, even with the ruling by the Supreme Court, the so-called refund to businesses and as a result of that to consumers is not clear how it can be done. So when you have something that is being ruled, when you don't have a way to implement it, how much does it count, really?
So what I think is going to happen is the following. The Trump administration, based on Secretary Bessent's comments in the last day, the Trump administration is going to collect as much as it can of the $134 billion in the 150 days of the 122 section implementation. That is then going to be offset against the $134 billion. And in his remarks, in addition, Secretary Bessent also indicated very clearly that he was not going to rule out further increasing the 301 and the 232 tariffs to make up the difference. So, my sense is that the Treasury is driving the bus here at the moment in terms of ensuring that it's not going to suffer any loss of revenue as a result of this ruling. And my second suggestion as to what's going to happen is that there's going to be a $2,000 per household refund that Trump is going to implement at some point this year. And that is going to be a generous gesture on the part of the Republican administration, refunding the profits of the tariffs to the consumers of the United States, without making any connection, of course, to the reality that those consumers actually paid for the tariffs that are now being refunded to them.
The best military commander is not he who fights 100 battles and wins every one of them. The best military strategy does not lead to the desiccation of the enemy's capital city. Decoding the Art of War will help you understand why there's no art in war and how Sun Tzu stayed undefeatable using the science of war, with fun stories and insightful breakdown of famous battles. Find Decoding the Art of War wherever you listen.
Anthony, your thoughts on this? Too little, too late for the Supreme Court? Secondly, how will the money really be refunded, which is a question mark regarding when Supreme Court ruling is being done, whether it can be implemented or not?
Well, I think the Supreme Court has said that the tariffs are illegal, and so they have to find a way to implement the Supreme Court ruling. But as you're well aware, the Supreme Court ruling did not specify or demand that the refunds be paid. That's supposed to be settled by the lower courts. The Court of International Trade will probably make that decision. But if the Court of International Trade makes that decision, I think it's very clear that the Trump administration will appeal it, and it will probably end up again in the Supreme Court. So that's why this is going to take quite a bit of time. With regard to many of the other comments you've made about the other countries, I think the other countries have already moved. I think that you see countries like India trying to get a little bit closer on the trade front with China. You've seen Canada moving in that direction. You've seen Latin America, Brazil, many countries are getting a little bit more excited about talking to China about trade arrangements. They don't want to call it a major trade deal because of the fact that they don't want to sort of raise the ear of the White House and have them impose even further increases in trade or tariffs.
Yeah.
But they are clearly moving in that direction. So there is an impact from all this uncertainty already around the world, whether it's Europe, whether it's Canada, or other parts of the world,
Right.
Moving a little bit closer to China.
Among the Supreme Court judges, those who voted against the current administration's power to exert tariffs like this, citing the IEEPA, two of them were actually nominated by President Trump himself. So many wonder, what does this mean, 6-3 ruling at the U.S. Supreme Court?
The justices that were appointed by the president and voted against the IEEPA tariffs were simply looking at the Constitution. Everybody knows that the power to tax belongs to Congress, unless Congress chooses to delegate that power to the president. And what these justices basically said was that Congress did not delegate that power to the president, and that the power to tax, because tariffs are a tax, belongs to Congress. And what they also said was that if Congress wants to delegate that power to the president, then they have to be more explicit about making that well known. So I don't think that these justices that were appointed by the president were necessarily being disloyal. They were simply following the Constitution.
Their obligation is to be loyal to the Constitution and not to the appointing authority. And fortunately, they are appointed not with the possibility of term renewal, but for as long as they care to serve. And so you actually have a situation here where two of the three justices that were appointed by President Trump have voted against him on this particular issue. They've supported him on many other issues, but they have asserted their independence, judicial independence, and to use a word we don't often have a chance to use these days, to my mind, that is extremely refreshing.
I think the evidence is quite clear, and I mean the case is quite clear. So these judges, ranging from different kind of interpretive, philosophies, would all agree with, the majority, with Chief Justice Roberts. When you look at the two major reasons that they are, ruling this illegal, one has to do with, this act was really a extension or revision of the earlier, Trading with Enemy Act, and it's really to talk about during the Cold War era how to deal with adversaries, right? By blocking financial dealings, by freeze assets, by block trade, and so on. It doesn't mention anything like tariffs or duties or taxes in the whole act. So I agree with what Anthony was saying, that the taxing power is the Congress's prerogative, right? Unless the Congress delegate that. So that's one major reason, I think, why. And second is that Chief Justice Roberts also cited the major question doctrine, which is basically, this is very unprecedented. This act has never been used by any presidents prior as a reason to impose taxes. So I think, these two are really very convincing, I think, very compelling reasons for the court to rule this way.
Right.
And I would agree. I think that, regardless of being loyal to Trump or not, I think the evidence it's clear, and the interpretation of the Constitution is clear. So this is quite inevitable.
What would that mean for the other economy? For example, China.
This ruling, it's a positive factor when it comes to U.S.-China trade relations. Because we know after Busan summit, pretty much the Chinese tariff now under IEEPA are 10% fentanyl related, and then 10% the so-called reciprocal tariff, right? The additional 24% reciprocal tariff was suspended for a year. So I think what this means with the ruling is that this 15% should be replaced, the 20% IEEPA related tariffs. But I think, the more decisive, sort of change between the U.S. and China will really, I think, would come after Donald Trump's visit to China, right, which is scheduled by, to the end of March and early April. Because I think that between the two countries, there are way more issues than trade, right? And of course, this trade war, even though it has reduced China's exports to the United States, but China was able to more than make up for the loss, right, of the U.S. market and diversify to non-U.S. markets, and also by adding more value added on its exports. So this is not really a major issue from China's perspective. But other issues that I think China is way more interested in discussing with the United States has to do with tech restrictions, has to do with, companies are being put on the entity list, has to do with, the disputes about China's industrial policies, the currency policies, and even, some other geopolitical issues like Taiwan or even Iran. So I think all of these issues go beyond simple, tariffs. And I think that it will take the both presidents multiple levels of these kinds of high-level meetings and ongoing negotiations to find really some of the more stabilizing trajectory between the two. So this is only a positive but not decisive, I think, change when it comes to U.S.-China relations.
Sitting in the chair of the White House, how would you look at the overall picture?
Trump administration does not believe in multilateral trade. They believe more in dealing with countries one at a time, bilateral trade. And then with respect to why this action was taken, I think it's pretty straightforward. The Supreme Court made this decision. You saw a lot of the write-up and a lot of the discussion in the press that the president was handed a loss, and the president doesn't like to lose. So in order to make it appear as though there was no loss, doubling down, as Professor Liang mentioned, was the strategy that they chose, because by doubling down, you could almost, or at least give the impression that you didn't lose, and they don't like to lose. So despite the fact that, as you correctly point out, it could come at a cost, because when you antagonize more and more countries, they're less likely to cooperate with you. But again, not giving the appearance of losing kind of trumped any other strategy that they could have taken, no pun intended.
Well, I think for the U.S. midterm, foreign policies usually don't move the needle. This is not something the American voters really pay too much attention or care about. What they really care about, of course, is the affordability crisis that the U.S. is experiencing right now. So to deal with that, I think Trump is usually using two strategies. One is to continue to hammer out this idea that these tariffs are paid by foreign governments or foreign businesses. So this is a win for the U.S., not to mention the so-called trillions of dollars of investment that he's able to bring back to the U.S. and create jobs. So he will continue to disseminate this kinds of, literally lies, right, to win the voters. And the second strategy that he would have is, again, to sort of accuse these Supreme Court judges in a very profound but very unfounded way, to say that these judges are swayed by foreign interests. I think this is a very serious accusation. But nonetheless, he would sort of portray himself as a fighter for the American people, against all odds, and so that he will continue to play that card. And last but not the least, I think he will actually exempt some of these tariffs when it comes to food prices, right? The Section 122, for example, has already made exemptions for a range of minerals and also agricultural products like beef and tomatoes. So I think this is the way for him to try to reduce a little bit the impacts of his tariffs on the U.S.'s affordability crises, and at the same time, again, sort of portray himself as a fighter for Americans against foreign interests.
I see. All right. I want to thank the three of you providing us much insight during all of these dramatic changes as we speak. Thank you so much, John Quelch, Yan Liang, Anthony Chen. Appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. I'm Tian Wei. Thanks for being with us.